Hey, what is up mortals, it's Edward Sailor here, and before we get into today's video, there's something I'd like to say. I'd like to let you all know that we have a merch store. Some of the items in it are only available for a limited amount of time, so if you're interested, go into the description and check it out. Each purchase helps us make more content. Secondly, if this video hits 500 likes by the end of the week, we will continue this what if. Thirdly, if you didn't know, only 41.3% of you guys are subscribed to us. So please hit that subscribe button and click the bell icon. Now with that out of the way, let's get into the story. Young Midoriya tossed and turned that night. The boy was clearly unable to sleep. The possibility of a child of a high-profile villain at the very school he is attending made him restless. It ate at him at all hours of the night, causing him to sweat in his bed. A sense of dread balled up in his chest and throat, making it hard for him to breathe. This was the last thing he needed as he prepared himself for the next day of school. What didn't help matters was Toya's disappearance. The green-haired child thought of it and him every day. Where could he have gone? Did a villain get him? Were villains everywhere at this point?
To be a truly great hero, you can't fear villainous trash, Izuku. Fear is weakness, and villains know that.
It echoed throughout the boy's skull as if it were screamed in an empty cave. But how could it not be? The only sort of combat training he knew was when he sparred with Shoto, and during his very sparring training lessons with Enji. He had no experience in dealing with villains, potential or otherwise. Midoriya felt sick to his stomach, like at any moment he would throw up on his floor. The boy got up from his bed and made his way out to the front yard, hoping to catch some air. As he approaches the front porch, he spotted Shoto, sitting on the top step, hugging his knees. He was curled up into himself as if he were an animal defending his vital organs from predators. His hand was balled up and covered his mouth. Midoriya looked upon his adoptive brother. A pensive look plastered across his face. He wanted to comfort him, perhaps even have a heart-to-heart. He was unspoken amongst the entire family, but Midoriya knew Shoto was resentful of him. A stranger taken in by his father and given far better treatment than Shoto ever received in either of their lives. Midoriya watched him for a while through the doorway before shutting it and returning to his room. He lied in bed for the remainder of the night, staring up in his ceiling. It has been the least amount of sleep he's ever had since the death of his mother, Inko. The next morning, Midoriya and Shoto ate breakfast without Enji. He had left early, evidently. The breakfast was quiet. It was tense. Without Enji there to make any semblance of a conversation, the atmosphere was so thick it could be cut with a knife. After what seemed like an eternity to him, Midoriya finally spoke up.
So, a villain at our school, huh?
Midoriya asked, clearly trying to make a conversation. Son of a villain. Shoto's voice was as flat as ever. He didn't even look at the green-haired boy as he spoke. He clearly didn't want to have this conversation with Midoriya of all people for a number of reasons. Another wave of silence hit them.
Are you...
He paused, his face scrunched into one of discomfort.
Are you nervous at all?
Why would I be? Shoto asked. He finally looked up from his food to make eye contact with Midoriya. He was practically shooting daggers at the poor boy. I'm not weak. Midoriya knew what he was referring to. This was his cue to shut up, but the boy couldn't help but shoot back a glare of his own. After a moment of prolonged eye contact, Shoto looked back down at his food as he prepared to eat once more. You should worry about the villain, not yourself. Shoto flatly added before shoveling his breakfast into his mouth, intent on not saying anything else. Midoriya kept glaring at Shoto, his eyes feeling dry from not blinking.
Son of a villain?
He retorted, hissing through his teeth. With that, Midoriya picked up the rest of his food and carried it back into his room, though he had long since lost his appetite. His adoptive brother sneered as he exited the dining room. Time passed, and they had both walked to school. While physically they walked together, they were separate the entire time. Things were still sour between them from breakfast. The one moment Midoriya tries connecting with Shoto, he spits in his face. What gives? Midoriya had done nothing to the boy. As they approached 1A, Shoto shoved past him, speedwalking towards his seat. Clearly he didn't wish to be associated with the young man, especially considering what followed. As Midoriya had started to pass through the doorway, the classroom fell silent. Their faces had clear fear, disdain, or outright hatred. How pleasant, However, what was jarring to young Izuku was Bakugo. Even he was watching him with clear caution on his face. This was startling to Midoriya, as for the longest time, it was him who picked on the green-haired kid. After Bakugo realized Midoriya had noticed him and his apparent fear, the blonde quickly looked away from him. Unlike the other students, whose fear was more subdued by caution, Kaminari was more apparent. He darted towards his seat, which happened to be right behind Shoto. Kaminari leaned into his desk, making quiet noises to get Shoto's attention.
Bro, I heard he killed your mom. That's tough, man. I'm sorry.
Kaminari whispered. Shoto opened his mouth to say something, but decided against it. He figured that saying anything to this troglodyte would be a waste of time. Instead, he opted to pinch the bridge of his nose and release a sharp sigh. Kaminari placed a hand on Shoto's shoulder, completely misreading the situation.
Don't touch me.
The red and white-haired boy hissed at the clueless blonde, causing him to quickly retract his hand. The only one to not outright react to him, or rather anything going on in the classroom, was this mysterious boy. His white hair reflected the fluorescent light emitted from the ceiling lights, and his face was of emotionless determination. Midoriya noticed him because this boy was the only student to not shoot him weird looks, or any sort of look for that matter. He didn't look at Midoriya, no matter how long he stared at him. Uraraka, however, was the more accepting of Midoriya's appearance. Unlike the rest, she figured it was merely speculation at best. Either way, he had saved her from the giant robot. Her face gleamed as she approached the schoolboy.
Hey, Deku!
Uraraka exclaimed, much to the rest of the class and Midoriya's shock. The boy, while not as awkward, was still surprised by the sudden interaction.
Oh, hey!
He hardly interacted with anyone outside of Enji. This was a first for him. After the two had started talking to each other, the class resumed chatter amongst themselves, albeit slowly and more cautiously. Midoriya and Uraraka spoke amongst themselves and talked about their first day of school. The plucky brunette took particular interest in the orientation and what friends she might make, much to their teacher's chagrin. It didn't help that he had been cocooned in a drab yellow sleeping bag behind them. After exiting the sleeping bag, the teacher introduced himself as Shota Aizawa. It was evident that he was a man who held punctuality and discipline above all else, even personal hygiene and a proper sleeping schedule apparently. Midoriya thought the name Aizawa sounded familiar somehow. He just couldn't place his finger on it. It tugged at the back of his mind like something he should remember, but for some reason couldn't. Their rather strict teacher, instead of letting them go to orientation like the rest of the school, had made them put on school-provided gym uniforms and brought them outside to the field to test their quirks. Anyone who ranked last faced immediate on-the-spot expulsion. The very prospect put the fear of God in the young schoolboys and girls, except for Shoto, Bakugo, and this white-haired mystery person. During the 50-meter dash, several of the students were using their quirks to the best of their ability in order to make it through point A to point B in record time. After Bakugo and Midoriya, Yaoyorozu and the white-haired student went up to the track, they readied themselves as they waited for the signature bang. As soon as they heard the minuscule explosion of gunpowder, the two students started sprinting forward. The white-haired student initially appeared to be only slightly faster than the other, more professionally inclined girl. Suddenly, in a similar fashion to Bakugo, the mystery student leaned forward and stretched his arms out towards his back. The air around his hands began to visibly distort, like his hands were creating an entirely new atmosphere around them. He suddenly leaped upward, the pressurized air rapid-firing from his palms, launching himself forward. This mystery student clocked in at 4.1 seconds. Bakugo grimaced and scowled at this sight. His teeth pressed together so hard, he could have shattered them through sheer force alone. This little nobody dared steal his technique and actually do slightly better than him? This made the wrathful blonde more furious than he had ever been in his life.
Hey, bastard!
Bakugo sparked at the strange student. Bakugo promptly launched himself towards his newfound rival using a series of explosions. He hadn't even known his name, and he already felt the need to murder him.
Get your own damn technique!
Bakugo neared his opponent, his right arm pulled back to deliver a devastating right hook to the temple. The student held his hands in front of his face and put himself in a defensive position, ready to try and step aside the explosive aggressor. All Midoriya could do was watch in horror as his former bully prepared himself to brutalize the student. That was until Bakugo suddenly started to stagger out of the air. He had suddenly stopped producing fiery nitroglycerin blasts from his palms and began to fall from the air clumsily. At this height, he was sure to break something. That would be if Aizawa hadn't caught him out of the sky using his scarf. For a piece of cloth, it wrapped tightly around Bakugo, making sure he couldn't move. He began to writhe within the confines of the scarf, attempting to break himself free, to no avail.
I erased your quirk,
Aizawa said. The tone of his voice, while flat as ever, was apparently seething. Clearly he had no patience for troublemakers like Bakugo. Using his scarf, he reeled in the rabid blonde like he were a fish he had just caught from the local pond. He turned Bakugo to his face. He made eye contact with the boy to make sure his words would not be lost on the raging delinquent.
Last I checked, you don't have a patent on wantonly launching yourself through the air using your quirk. I shouldn't have to tell you that attacking a classmate because they did something similar to you is extremely illogical. Not to mention not okay.
Aizawa then pulled on his scarf, quickly unraveling the boy and causing him to tumble. Needless to say, this only made the boy angrier. He started to feel a tight squeezing sensation on his skull as he kept thinking about this little no-name copying his technique, and the teacher actually siding against him.
Pull that again, and you're expelled, no matter what score you get here.
Coupled with Aizawa's clear obsession with logic, this was
Eraserhead,
Midoriya said to himself. Though normally his tone would be all kinds of giddy, he couldn't help but feel melancholic. He figured he had properly repressed that fateful night. That night where his quirk first activated. Aizawa looked at Midoriya ever so slightly. Before we get back into the story, I would like to say that we've got a second channel called Anime Deep Dive. Anime Deep Dive goes over the hard facts of the anime presented. Now in case you guys didn't know, we have a third channel called Anime Theory. Anime Theory mainly focuses on a large variety of mind-boggling anime theories. If you're interested in content like this, please go check the description below or click the eye icon in the top right corner. Now with that out of the way, let's get back into the story. Truth was, the racer hero had recognized the young lad the very second he laid eyes on him. He felt for the boy, he really did, but he couldn't be open about that. The world of heroes and villains wouldn't care about the boy's strife, so he couldn't be open about his concern either. Bakugo's breathing started to get heavier and heavier. He turned towards Aizawa as if he had something to say, but he reminded himself of his lifelong passion, to be the #1 hero. So instead he bit his tongue and stood back up, dusting himself off. The white-haired student then approached the blonde, his expression neutral as ever.
If it's any consolation, Bakugo, I personally like the idea of launching yourself through the air using your quirk.
The students didn't know whether this kid was being genuine or not. His tone of voice, which somehow managed to be more expressionless than Aizawa's, didn't help matters. Bakugo stared at this boy with abject disgust. First he had the audacity to steal his technique, then he would dare be condescending to him? At least that's what Bakugo assumed. The visibly wrathful student snarled at this opposer and began walking away from him.
Piss off, freak!
The blonde growled at his new rival. As Bakugo started to walk away from the boy to stand over by the fence, Midoriya started to feel concerned for his troubled former bully.
Are you...
Midoriya stammered.
Are you okay, Kacha?
Shut the hell up, Deku!
For a moment, Bakugo was so angry he had completely forgotten about his apprehension towards the green-haired boy. It was actually refreshing to Midoriya for Bakugo to not be afraid of him like he was earlier, though he still didn't know why he was to begin with, let alone the rest of the class. The tests went on and Midoriya was doing surprisingly well. This was what he got for periodically training with the #2 hero and his adoptive father, Endeavour. While he wasn't as good as either Shoto or the mysterious student, or even Bakugo, he was at least racking up a decent score. It came time for the ball throwing contest. Bakugo had set a record of 701 meters when the trial first started. It would prove difficult for most of the class to even match that. Shoto, as expected from Midoriya, had done the best so far, barring Uraraka's score of infinity. Midoriya stepped up to the chalk circle in the dirt. He gripped the baseball tightly. He stretched his arm back and then swung overhead with all his strength. For good measure, he released a gust of fire from his palm shortly after. The hot air pushed the baseball further. Despite his fairly decent range, it still couldn't hold a candle to Shoto's.
How embarrassing,
Shoto remarked, disdain dripping from his words like viscous acid. Midoriya quickly turned towards his adoptive brother. An irate expression crawled across his face. Fire began to form in his hands before Aizawa spoke up again.
Need I remind the class that infighting will result in immediate expulsion?
Midoriya glared at the unpleasant boy he had called his brother. He filled his lungs with oxygen before letting the flames dissipate. This show of agitation caused the rest of the class to murmur amongst themselves. Even Uraraka looked concerned, though it appeared to be more for young Izuku's well-being. Midori scanned the class before returning to the crowd, a heavy expression across his face. Uraraka, being Izuku's only friend, approached him and put a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Are you okay?" Uraraka said, her voice reflecting her regard for Midoriya's welfare. Midoriya didn't even look at her, though he had given attention to her care. "Yeah." Midoriya wavered, thinking about his words. "Yeah, I'll be fine." Last was the white-haired student. His movements were graceful and delicate as he stepped up to the circle. It was almost like he wasn't touching the ground at all. Instead of the rest of the students who would throw their ball overhead, the lad simply held the ball at an upward angle. His classmates were understandably more than a little confused. But before their very eyes, the ball started to vibrate. It started slow, but it began to gradually become faster and faster, glowing red as it pulsated. He then let go of it, causing the ball to shoot forward at an impressive rate, especially for someone at his age. The class watched, awestruck, as the ball fired off like a red-hot bullet. This even caused Aizawa to ever so slightly flinch, though no one would have noticed unless they were paying very close attention to him. Slowly he turned to face Shoto. He eyed him intently before walking back into the crowd. Todoroki was clearly confused. He hadn't said one word to the guy. Bakugo, being Bakugo, believed that this look was directed at him instead. This only fueled his overt hatred for the fellow classmate. He watched him with a look of unabated rage, the capillaries in his eyes threatened to burst at any minute. After all the trials had been completed, the students gathered around Aizawa to receive their results. Midoriya's score was unremarkably average. He wasn't in danger of failing, but his score wasn't going to turn heads. This was especially in comparison to Shoto, Bakugo, and Zaiku? Who's that?
That would be...
Aizawa trailed, almost as if he had already forgotten who his own students were.
him.
He then pointed over at the direction of the white-haired kid. Midoriya looked over at the expressionless classmate. He figured it was obvious in hindsight, especially due to his impressive physical exam scores. Midoriya looked back at the scoreboard. He noticed Zaiku and Shoto were almost neck and neck, with Zaiku being merely a couple of points off. Everyone was content with their placement, even Ayama, who was second to last. Everyone except the invisible girl that stood there, and while no one could see her face, they could tell she was devastated.
No, no,
Toru murmured. Her voice was wavery, like she was on the brink of tears.
no, please, let me try again. I can get a better score, I promise.
Aizawa gave her a cold stare. She knew the risk of failing the quirk apprehension test. To him, this gave her no right to beg for a redo.
Sorry, kid. Rules are rules.
Aizawa responded. Clearly he wasn't sorry. After all, she was the one who failed.
Perhaps try to be a police officer or a doctor. Those are just as respectable a profession as being a hero. I'm afraid you're just not UA material, let alone hero material.
Aizawa extended his arm forward, signalizing towards the exit of the field.
You're free to leave now and pick up your stuff from my classroom, but you aren't to stay here by the end of the day.
The invisible girl took a reflexive step back. She was taking in all the information she didn't want to hear, but she couldn't fight back against it. She slowly began to shuffle away from the crowd. Those that listened carefully heard sniffling sounds come from her direction as she vacated the area.
As for everyone else, I expect you to be here tomorrow.
Aizawa announced to the rest of the class.
That concludes class for today.
Aizawa began to walk away, the rest of the class shooting him grimaces. As of this point, he had established himself to be an undesirable and cruel teacher. At best, the rest of the students were relieved that it was finally over. As Aizawa made his way to the side of the school, he could feel a familiar presence looming over him.
A little cold, wouldn't you say, Aizawa?
The scruffy-looking hero turned to face the number one hero, All Might. He had his arms crossed and, despite his perpetual smile, seemed a bit perturbed by Eraser Hero's method of teaching.
It'd be illogical of me to let her down easy. She had the worst score of anyone in the class. Even the belly button laser kid did better.
Aizawa tonelessly stated,
But she's just a kid.
All Might remarked, his voice reflecting his disappointment in his fellow hero's lack of tact.
Exactly, you may be fine with sending someone practically quirkless at hardened villains, but I'd rather not have that on my conscience.
Aizawa countered. After that, he started to walk away from All Might. All Might, while annoyed with Aizawa's insistence on being logical, which at this point All Might figured was just Aizawa's excuse for being rude, couldn't help but think that he had a decent point in not letting her continue. He just wished his comrade would be more mindful that he is still working with youth. However, All Might didn't come to chew out Aizawa. As Aizawa left, the number 1 turned to face the class he had been watching at a distance. He took particular interest in the white-haired kid, though he reckoned it wasn't a good thing. There was just something eerily similar about the boy, but he couldn't place his finger on it. Thank you all for watching the video to the end. Now there's a few more things that I'd like to go over before the video ends. On behalf of We the Celestials, I'd like to thank the writer for this video and the editors for this video. Their details will be in the description. If you're a voice actor, editor, or writer, or you're interested in becoming one of those, go to the Discord that is in the description of this video and hit up the head of one of those areas. We're always looking for members to join us. That's it from us for today's video, so thank you all for watching, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you're interested, and hit that like button if you liked the video. Until next time, peace out mortals, have a fantastic day.